His Excellency Mr. João Mendes Gonzalez, Minister for Economy and Development of Timor Leste. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, honourable heads of state and government, colleague ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honour to be here representing the government of Timor Leste at this 15th conference of parties of the UNFCCC and 5th meeting of parties to the Kyoto Protocol. We would also like to express our gratitude to the government and people of Denmark for the hospitality in hosting this important international conference. Madam President, allow me also to take this opportunity to commend the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC for his leadership in convening this high-level event. Madam President, climate change has been increasingly threatening our world over the last decade. Both the world's socio-economic development and sustainability of the ecosystem have been seriously challenged and are becoming gradually more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. In the most developing countries, especially least developed countries, climate change impacts have been resulting in increasing poverty rate, food insecurity, famine, and malnutrition. Climate change impacts have also caused destruction of infrastructure, human environmental refugees, and biodiversity losses, and most of the LDCs have limited capacity to adapt to the impacts of climate change. In Timor-Leste, for instance, floods, droughts, and extreme weather events have been gradually increasing over the last decade, which caused thousands of people to lose their properties and being forced to displace from their habitats. These climate change impacts have significantly affected our national agriculture production and led to serious food shortage in areas heavily populated. As a matter of coincidence, just before I came here to deliver my speech, I received a call from Timor giving information that due to heavy rain, flooded creeks have destroyed and damaged 50 houses, leaving 50 families as environmental refugees. Madam President, this illustration is only aimed at describing that the most vulnerable people are those whose lives depend on the agriculture and fishing sectors, especially in the LDCs who have limited capacity to adapt to the consequences of climate change. We are victims of a climate change impacts caused by developed countries. In view of this, Madam President, developed countries must take a lead to undertake urgent, ambitious and decisive actions to reduce their emissions and to provide financial, technological and capacity building assistance to the most vulnerable countries, especially LDCs and SIDS, in order to enable them to adapt to climate change. We believe that the Kyoto Protocol is only an international legal binding mechanism for developed countries to reduce their emissions. Therefore, we need to conserve this protocol, and we are totally against an attempt to eliminate it. We fully support an amendment to the Kyoto Protocol here in Copenhagen in order to provide a new compliance mechanism and new targets to developed country parties to meet their emission reduction targets for the second commitment period. In addition, simplification of clean development mechanism needs to be fully taken into consideration. Madam President, we believe that in this conference we should decide on legally binding outcomes in order to achieve the ultimate objective of the Convention, namely reduction and stabilization of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities among parties. In this regard, developed country parties should reduce their greenhouse gases emissions by at least 45% below 1990 levels by 2020 and at least 80 to 95% below 1990 levels by 2050 in order to ensure that concentration of greenhouse gas emissions are well below 300 and 50 parts per million in CO2 equivalent levels. These ambitious emission reduction targets will ensure temperature limitation below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels that have been recommended by scientists. Madam President, we must decide here in Copenhagen a new legally binding agreement for the enhancement of full, effective and sustained implementation of the Convention based on the mandate of the Bali Action Plan and the work of AWG LCA. The Copenhagen Agreement must contain compliance provisions which enables developed country parties to comply with their commitments under the Convention, as well as to take their historical responsibility by providing financial, technological assistance, as well as capacity building to developing countries in order to support adaptation and mitigation programs. Any new agreement must also strongly address a new, additional, predictable, flexible, transparent, sustained, adequate and grant-based financial mechanism that can help the most vulnerable countries to respond efficiently and increase resilience to the impacts of climate change in the short, medium and long-term adaptation actions. Regarding predictability and sustainability of financial support, we believe that at least 1.5% GDP of developed countries needs to be allocated to climate change adaptation actions in developing countries, and 70% of this amount could be allocated to LDCs, SIDS, and African countries affected by drought. Madam President, sustainable financial support for NAPA's preparation and implementation in LDCs parties needs to be adequately addressed. In this regard, we urge all parties to decide here in Copenhagen a financial provision that requires legal obligations and commitments by developed countries to provide financial assistance through the Least Developed Countries Fund. This might help our current NAPA preparation and its further full implementation in a sustainable manner. Concluding, Madam President, the government of Timor Leste is also currently promoting a renewable energy policy and strategy, as well as conducting various related pilot projects in the field. For this, financial, technological and capacity building assistance is urgently required to address this national initiative on sustainable development approach. We believe that this initiative might be considered as part of NAMAs, which needs further support as it has been put in the negotiation text under the AWG LCA. Timor-Leste has also joined with some of its neighbor and regional countries, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea, to share our concerns and define a strategy towards the protection and conservation of our coral reefs and marine biodiversity through the signing of a Coral Triangle Initiative. We therefore propose to the parties to consider the issue of coral and marine biodiversity protection and conservation under the CTI to be included into the AWG LCA text part of the Copenhagen outcome. The future of the planet is in our hands. Let us work together to save the world. I thank you, Madam President.